Friends and Paul Foncier for inviting me. It's the second time I'm here to give a talk in this series, and last time it was very interesting, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about my presentation. So what I would like to present today is some new work I've been doing on Indonesia's contemporary land reform, trying to understand what kind of beast it is, why it's taking the form that it does, why now, those kinds of questions to address why land is back on the agenda of the Indonesian government and a great many other parties. So to start, I think we would all recognize that land reform is an intervention. It's actually a big intervention into what Foucault called the relation between man and things, the classic terrain of governing in Foucault's terms. So throughout the 20th century, revolutions were fought over land reform, and many people died. In these places, land reform was a critical component, or understood to be a critical component, of the total transformation of society and its reconstruction along new lines. So if one's thinking about China, Vietnam, Soviet Union, land reform was understood to be a big deal, to be a completely political question, and was an affair over which many lives were lost. In Japan, Korea, and Taiwan in the 1950s, land reforms were also far-reaching. And in that case, although they were not violent, they were carried out under American military authority as part of post-war reconstruction. So, historically, one could say that it takes force, or at least threat of force, to take land away from one party and to give it or allocate it to another. So what then is land reform in the 21st century land reform? I would say that in the current vision, there is to be no revolution. Reform is to work on and through social processes and relations, enroll subjects, set conditions, alter practices, use law as an instrument, and basically to limit the use of force. So even on that plane, it's quite a different beast from the 20th century, mid-20th century versions. Land reform today is, in short, rendered technical, as difficult political and economic problems, such as injustice in relation to access to land, for example, is replaced by an emphasis on technical goals like legal certainty, stakeholder consultation, procedural fairness, and so on. The solutions to land problems appear to be technical, non-political, and win-win. This shift might seem to have made 21st century land reform a really boring topic, like big yawn. But I think we should make no mistake here. 21st century land reform, like its earlier version, means intervening in people's relations to land, and that's always a big deal. That always affects landscapes, livelihoods, identities, possible ways of living now and in future. It transforms relations between people and resources in fundamental ways. So even though it may not be the topic of revolution, it's still not a small thing. What then are the objectives to be achieved? 20th century land reform was about land to the tiller. Whether revolutionary, as in China and Vietnam, or counter-revolutionary, as in Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, where the goal was to improve the welfare of peasants in order to stem the red tide or to prevent a revolutionary form of land reform. Whether they were on the right or the left, basically actors in 20th century land reform were a fairly limited crew. The main phrasing was land to the tiller. So this assumes that you have a tiller, envisaged as a peasant, somebody who works the land, and then you have a landlord, somebody who's holding land in excess, from whom land must be taken and redistributed. In the 21st century version of land reform, peasants, or the concept of the peasant, is still key in some places. And I think a standout here is Brazil with its landless peoples movement. A lot of the imagery of La Via Campesina still highlights the concept of the tiller, the peasant, the kind of figure one might recognize from the 20th century version. But in Southeast Asia, I would say it's not so obvious, like who are the people, who are the actors, what they're doing on the land, what they want to do with it. So the beneficiaries of land reform now are not straightforward as the tillers that they once were, and quite often they're apprehended as quite different types of people. So we get forest dwellers, indigenous people, small and medium enterprises, and many other kind of actors or targets or objects of the assumed reform. What are the objectives to be achieved? 21st century land reform, I would say these objectives or these goals have really proliferated. Environmental governance, forest conservation, mitigation of climate change, recognition of ethnic territories, enhancement of land markets, increases of the GNP, like a whole range of different objectives travel under or are attached to the land reform umbrella. So corresponding to a proliferating class of actors, also the objectives have grown. So we have a heterogeneous objectives, heterogeneous actors, and also quite a diverse set of practices, discourses, and technologies, forms of knowledge, bureaucratic formations, inscription devices, and so on. A whole cluster of different kinds of elements which are assembled awkwardly and provisionally under the label land reform. So this is the terrain I want to explore in this lecture, using what I call the analytic of assemblage to identify the main elements involved and to try to examine how they hold together. So my focus is Indonesia, which launched a major program of land reform in 2016, delving into the voluminous documents, mostly grey literature, produced by Indonesian government, NGOs, donors, and experts in various fields. It was not the figure of the landlord and the peasant that jumped out from the pages. It was some surprising figures, commons, co-ops, and corporations. Those are the figures that are present everywhere in the land reform documents today, which leads me to question, why does Indonesia's current land reform hinge on these figures? Why is land reform happening now? What are the different actors that have been enrolled in this program? And what are the agendas that have been made to align? Also, what kinds of knowledge are brought to bear to legitimate interventions? So, and also a question I think one has to ask about any assemblage is what I call the constitutive exclusions, or what are the elements, the actors, the configurations of power, etc., which are excluded from this assemblage, which are left on the outside as things which are not to be addressed. So you may notice that in posing these questions, I'm drawing on some earlier work I did on what I called practices of assemblage, in which I identified 6 key practices that are needed to make a governmental program, basically, a planned intervention into the relations between man and things, governmental in Foucault's sense, but to make such an assemblage cohere. And just what I came up with is that these are some of the things that have to go on. First of all, you have to forge alignments between different sets of objectives, different kinds of actors. You have to, at some level, render technical. Like the whole field of land reform has to be rendered as a set of relations that can be formulated as a diagram, in which a problem A plus intervention B will produce C, a beneficial result. Third, you have to have what I call authorizing. You have to authorize this intervention. Like an intervention has to be backed up by a requisite body of knowledge, which confirms the enabling assumptions, contains the critiques, specifies the procedures for monitoring progress towards the goal, and so on. So certain kinds of knowledge have to be brought into this assemblage. Fourth, you have to manage the failures and the contradictions. So presenting failure as the outcome of rectifiable deficiencies, smoothing out contradictions so that they seem superficial rather than fundamental, devising compromises, like all of that kind of work has to be done to hold such an assemblage together. Fifth, anti-politics, reposing political questions as matters of technique, closing down debate about how and what to govern and the distributive effects of particular arrangements by reference to expertise, encouraging citizens to engage in debate while limiting the agenda, like the staged stakeholder dialogue, that kind of thing. And finally, reassembling, grafting on new elements and reworking old ones, deploying existing discourses to new ends, transposing the meaning of key terms. So I outlined this in something I wrote 2007 as a kind of analytic of assemblage, like how to analyze and assemblage some kind of a governmental program into its elements in order to understand how does this thing actually be assembled? Like, what is the work of assembling it and enabling it to cohere despite its fragmentary and often disjunctive origins? So, key features of the land reform assemblage that I've identified in Indonesia, the commons, co-ops, and corporations, which are sort of inside the assemblage. One of the reasons I think they are there is their capacity to mutate, to morph, to signify, basically to hold different meanings and to do different things for different actors while making win-win solutions seem possible and keeping contradictions and intractable problems at bay. So I would argue that these three figures, figure as part of the assemblage because of this capacity they have to somehow bring people around to think that land reform is something they can support and be involved in. So I'm suggesting that one has to read the presences, basically what's inside here, in relation to the absences and what's left out. So just to be cheeky, I've given these C's as well, what I'm calling crony corporate cabals, which is the basic configuration of power at the local level in ways that I will describe. Capitalist relations, like the fact that capitalism tends to routinely produce polarization and dispossession is something which cannot be admitted inside the land reform assemblage. And communists and corpses, gruesome, but in fact in Indonesia these are absolutely essential constitutive exclusions in the sense that, as I will explain, Indonesia once had a land reform which was viciously truncated, with the murder of 500,000 people. Basically, communists and corpses are the element which must be kept outside in order to enable this assemblage to have any semblance of credibility. Okay, so what then are? I should give a little bit of background to land reform in Indonesia. First of all, Indonesia's, as I just mentioned, Indonesia's it had a land to the tiller reform, which was going on in the 50s and 60s. There was a land law passed in 1960 of a land to the tiller variety, which was common of the mid-20th century land reform genre. It was truncated, though, by the massacre of 500,000 people, the eradication of the Communist Party, and the affiliated farmer and plantation workers' unions. So at that time, in 1960, the Indonesian Communist Party was the third largest outside China and the Soviet Union, so it was a huge party, but it was an electoral party. It was elected by popular vote, it was unarmed, it was a normal political party inside the normal political system, until suddenly it wasn't, until suddenly the army basically took over, the massacres ensued, and anyone who had been affiliated with the party or its relevant unions was killed, imprisoned, and basically eliminated. So after this event, land reform was completely absent in the agenda. That was sort of end of it. Throughout the rest of the 60s, the 70s, and well into the 80s, you couldn't even talk about land reform in Indonesia of any kind. So its reemergence today in 2016, when this land reform began, you could say is already an achievement. Activists worked for 2 decades to get the stalled project of land reform back on the agenda and push it forward. These activists, an interesting feature is that many of these activists, people I've known for decades who were in the NGO wilderness, are now inside the government. They've been recruited by the current government, and they are the ones designing and now are finally attempting to implement the land reform that they have been dreaming of, except that it's not quite the one they were dreaming of. It's the one that they think is the best they can get, under current political economic conditions. So today's land reform is definitely born of compromise. It's a compromise for all the people involved in it on all sides of the equation. So what are the main problems it has to address? First of all, Indonesia has a long history of landlessness. Chronic landlessness and inequality go back in Java since the beginning of the 19th century. So already around 1830, at least a third of Java's population was already landless. So this isn't a new phenomenon in Java. So that's one problem, an unresolved problem of landlessness in Java, which is still heavily agrarian, where a great many people have little to no land. The second element is the state claim to the forest. So the Suharto's government in 1967, after the massacres, proclaimed about 65% of the national territory to be state forest. So laid state claim to what Nancy Pelosi calls the political forest, the state-claimed forest under the jurisdiction of the Forest Department, in which, in principle, absolutely no habitation or agriculture could take place. Although the Forest Department was able to lease out this land for timber concessions and sometimes also for plantations. But basically, all of this land under state control, at the same time, 60 to 70 million people lived on this land. So it was not empty land. It was people's customary land, their farmland, the land they used for shifting cultivation, for rubber, for various cash crops, and so on. So through this declaration of 65% of the land as state forest, the land tenure of 60 to 70 million people was rendered radically insecure. They weren't all evicted, because you can't evict all the people all the time, but they were on land which the state claimed, and they could always be accused of being squatters, of being illegal, of being communist, which is always a threat, and chased away. So the radical insecurity of people on state-claimed forest is another huge element, a problem to be addressed. The third one, the one that I think of as the biggest contemporary emergency, and it's the one that I talked about last time in the Paul Foncier a few years ago, has to do with plantations, the massive expansion of plantations, particularly oil palm, but also mining concessions and other large-scale land uses, is basically what one could call a reverse land reform. It involves taking land from the people to give it to plantations or mining corporations on a massive scale. So that's a process which is still going on. So at the same time as they're talking about land reform, which one may think about, distributing to the people, the reverse is actually happening daily and often violently. So this large-scale land acquisition for plantations, for mines, and so on, daily provokes conflict, violence, arrest, eviction, injury, and death. So there is still a violent element to this, but it's not to the land reform, it's to the reverse land reform, this ongoing process. Okay, so what's the plan? If that's the problem, what's the plan? The plan announced for the land reform is to take a portion, 12 plus million hectares of the state-claimed forest, and allocate it to social forestry. So this means it will still remain under state control, but people will be permitted certain kinds of uses which are considered compatible with the forest. As we'll see later, not much is actually considered compatible with the forest. It's beekeeping, butterfly collecting, maybe some tourism or something like that. But it's extremely modest uses. But nevertheless, social forestry is what it's called. And the idea is that through the vehicle of social forestry, some of the people living on the state-claimed forest will be legalized, will have a sort of legitimate capacity to live there and to gain some income there. Another 4.5 million hectares of non-forest lands, that's land outside the forest estate, is to be legalized, which is basically a land titling program of a familiar variety. These people already have the land, but their holdover it is to be formalized. 4.5 million hectares is supposed to be taken out of the state-claimed forest and allocated to beneficiaries. So that's effectively a devolution of state-claimed land to the people. Of course, the people are already there, so not actually new people. And concessions, these massive plantations and so on, are not to be rescinded, but conflicts are to be resolved on a case-by-case basis. So if you look at the agenda, it's pretty modest, right? It's basically titling, a bit of social forestry, and a bit of conflict management. Like, it's not a whole lot to get excited about, but this is what they have been able to put on the table. Nevertheless, even making this happen, although it looks quite straightforward, But in many ways, even this land reform agenda is quite fantastic in the sense that it has to somehow make plausible and actionable any one of these elements, right? The idea that you could actually solve conflicts, the idea that people could actually get a livelihood from within the forest estate without deforesting it, and the taking 4.5 million hectares and giving it to the people, like none of this is actually at all obvious that it can be made to happen. What I'm most interested in here, though, is the way that these figures of the commons, the co-ops, and the corporations somehow make this all seem plausible and like something that different actors can get behind. So why these figures? Starting with the commons. The commons figures in the land reform documents in three different ways. First of all, is what I call the customary commons of indigenous people. So that's the idea long promoted by Indonesia's indigenous land rights activists, that what they call customary communities have been in place in Indonesia since time immemorial, since long before the state claimed the forest, in fact, long before Indonesia was colonized, and that these people held inalienable territories which they managed according to their own rules long before the state existed. So the figure of the customary community is one anchored to a piece of common land which is managed according to customary practices. Vague recognition of such communities and territories actually exists in quite a few of Indonesia's legal instruments, but in practice is extremely weak and easily undermined. Support assembled around these customary communities in the 1990s, drawing from the transnational discourse in indigenous peoples, using the legal instruments like ILO 169. Basically, an indigenous peoples movement has grown up in Indonesia and has been pressing for the recognition of common land for its customary or indigenous communities. So they thought they achieved a huge breakthrough in 2013 when they put a case before Indonesia's constitutional court, but with a catch. The way the court ruled was that in order for a customary claim to be recognized and therefore removed from the forest estate and returned to the community assumed to have always held that land, the people had to conform to really tight criteria. And these were basically the criteria of 19th century evolutionary anthropology. And in fact, they were directly lifted from Dutch, colonial era scholarship on custom and customary communities. So one could say that a form of customary community imagined by the Dutch has now come back to be the instrument that the Indonesian indigenous rights activists have used, but also that the court has now recognized, complete with its 19th century evolutionary assumptions. So the court ruled that in order to be recognized, such communities, and I'm loosely paraphrasing here, must have mechanical solidarity, limited division of labor, togetherness and uniformity, no strong leaders, self-sufficiency, and low literacy. So they're imagining kind of tribes, people who are rather primitive, like a bit out of the mainstream. The ruling also notes that such a community would cease to exist when, under the influence of science and technology, people change and are no longer distinct from the general population. So what's envisaged is a particularly sort of backward kind of people who will eventually blend in with the ordinary Indonesian villager. But only to the extent and so long as they remain different and distinct can their rights be recognized. So you can see that puts the advocates in a really tight position, because they either have to help these people create and conjure the appearance of sufficient difference in order for them to be recognized under the Constitutional Court ruling, or they have to recognize that in fact they are already part of the general population, and therefore they have no hope of reclaiming their land from the Forest Department, right? So they've caught themselves in a rather tight bind. So what's happening for the moment is that the Indigenous advocacy group, AMAN, and its allies are working hard to render customary communities legible in the format that official recognition requires. So they're busy mapping customary territories, describing customary land use systems, and they highlight customary rules for forest protection. Not surprisingly, they foreground the approved elements, giving local names for different types of forest and farm. They particularly emphasize knowledge of medicinal plants. That sort of idea of indigenous technical knowledge is something which fits. But they occlude dissonant ones like cash cropping, individual land holding, the presence of migrants, and the multiple axes of inequality, gender, generation, aristocratic rank, and land ownership, which in fact characterize most of these communities, right? They're not actually the sort of egalitarian havens they're made out to be. But these occluded elements, you could say, are constitutive. They have to be occluded in order for these communities to qualify for the kinds of common land which the law now enables. So something quite important has shifted here through this advocacy, and that is that whereas during the Dutch period, although the Dutch did recognize the idea of customary community, they never mapped, they never listed, there was no identity card saying you belong to X community of X place and this is your land. It was a very loose concept of customary law. But now this is being made concrete, right? People are being called upon to map their lands. In fact, the head of the Indigenous advocacy group issued a call. He said, map your land before someone else maps it. So basically, the season of mapping is on. If you want to have any land, you have to join this wave, and the way to do it is by making visible a people, a place, a bounded group, a bounded territory, complete with its rules, and on that basis, you may have a hope of holding on to something. Also, what this has done is it's made a definitive division among the people. So you now have ordinary villages, or you have these customary communities. Now, this is something which on the ground is actually not at all obvious, right? Since most rural Indonesians consider that they adhere to custom, and since land titles are extremely rare in rural Indonesia, most people actually access their land through custom, right? In the sense that I know what's mine, you know what's yours, I won't mess with you, you won't mess with me. If we have a conflict, we'll go to some elders who will help us to sort it out. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and give you a fine. Basically that kind of rough and ready customary understanding is what governs most rural land in Indonesia, because almost none of it is titled. So those are the effective systems, but if that was the case, everybody, one could say, is governed by customary law, but they don't fit this criteria of, no cash crops, basically no cash, no individual land rights, and so on, which is quite an extreme kind of image. Okay, so that's the customary commons of indigenous people. The second kind of group that's coalesced around the idea of the commons is what I call the commons of conservation and climate change. And the mapping of indigenous territories has been very heavily financed by transnational donor agencies, the World Bank and others, for whom indigenous communities permanently ensconced on common land align with objectives for land governance, forest conservation, and climate change mitigation. So the linking of indigeneity to conservation is long-standing in Indonesia, as it is elsewhere. The idea is that the destruction of forests is equated with the destruction of indigenous people. So by extension, advocates argue, indigenous people saved can save the forest, basically. So there's a direct linkage is made. Globally, the claim that indigenous people and local communities, as they're called, holding secure collective rights can be trusted to conserve forests has very wide currency, and it's been strongly promoted by the Washington-based Rights and Resources Initiative, which has conducted research to put some very large numbers behind it. So here we could say is a kind of an authorizing knowledge behind this element of the assemblage, and to read some of their recent research, it boldly announces, quote, almost 2.5 billion people, a third of the world's population, depend on community-held lands for their livelihoods. They manage over 50% of the world's lands, although they legally own just 10%. The fix proposed by this think tank group for this gap is technical. Legal recognition of the customary commons is, quote, fundamental to the advancement of global peace, prosperity, and sustainability, and to solving the related crises of inequality and climate change. Win-win, basically, right? Who could not get behind such an agenda presented in these terms? Hence, they say it's urgent for, and look at their list of actors, urgent for philanthropists, investors, companies, and NGOs to capitalize on a proven and cost-effective climate change strategy which, quote, protects everyone's right to live in a more just, prosperous, and verdant world. So many actors are enrolled here into this concept of a win-win solution. So what's the awkwardness? I talked about managing failures, managing contradictions. What fits awkwardly is, of course, the definition of what is a community-held land right. Like 2.5 billion people with community-held land rights makes you wonder, how have we not noticed this so far, right? Of course, they don't really define it in their documents, but what one can read is that their definition is an ample one, and it's partly enabled by the elision of indigenous people and local communities. They become one. In fact, they call them IPLC, Indigenous People and Local Communities, which are precisely the two categories of people that Indonesia's new legal regime tends to separate. Like you're either indigenous and therefore are assumed to have common land, or you are an ordinary local villager, in which case you're not assumed to hold your land in common, but perhaps individually. Now all of these are incorporated under this very ample category. Also keen to recognize commons or donors funding REDD. I think many of you who've worked in areas where REDD schemes is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, known as REDD. This is a kind of scheme for which maps and boundaries are crucial, because the scheme gives money either to governments or to communities as compensation for not deforesting. So if you reduced your deforestation by not doing what you would otherwise have done, as in cut it down to plant an oil palm plantation, then you are compensated for this. But in order for compensation schemes to work, the recipient has to have a legal personality. Like, who are you going to compensate? So you need a commons, you need a community, you need a definite group. And what's more, these are contractual relations. You actually have to bind people contractually into agreeing to what they will do and what they will not do. So most of the REDD programs are very strongly behind the idea of the communal land, because it solves these problems as to who will be the holder of the contract, who will be the payee, who will be held responsible for actually reducing forest degradation. Okay, the third one, a new commons for land reform beneficiaries. This comes from quite a different thread of thinking. And this comes from land rights activists working with landless farmers who've been for some decades seeking to gain access to land on a land-to-the-tiller basis. So these are groups of farmers, usually people living on the fringes of plantations or forest concessions, often plantations which are defunct, maybe they're overgrown, and people occupy this land. And sometimes in mass movements, particularly around the time of the fall of Suharto, but still today, you get sort of basically land invasions by organized groups who then want to get recognition for their land. What most of the people assumed was that once they had occupied this land, they would get, and they hoped to get, individual title to it. But the promoters of this land reform, the activists who helped to organize it, have learned from bitter experience that people who get individual title are very prone to lose it. So in many of their studies, 5 years after the land invasion, most of the original people have gone, most of the land has become a commodity, it's already changed hands, and so they've become convinced that the people cannot actually be trusted with individual title, and they're much safer in the long term if they can be pinned down onto an area of communal land, which therefore is held in perpetuity. So people may come and go, but the land will still be there. Land for the people appears to be much more secured through a communal title than it does through individual one. So this, again, is not at all unique to Indonesia. Many land reform programs, the one in the Philippines for sure, but others as well, have this criterion that even if land is allocated individually, it may not be bought or sold for a moratorium of 10 years or so. And these are all efforts to try to help people to hold on to the land that they've struggled for so hard and not to lose it quickly through common mechanisms of debt, mortgage, competition, being bought out or bullied out by stronger parties. So when the land reform group insists that all of the land reclaimed must be under communal title, it's with this kind of protective agenda in mind. Colonial authorities often had a similar agenda, something I've written about in another paper. But the difficulty with it is that it basically it's one thing to draw a boundary and say this now is a commons, but the kinds of institutional work that you would need to do to actually manage a commons, to come up with correct, with rules for how it will be managed, how uses and benefits will be divided, what do you do about credit, what do you do about debt, etc. These are actually quite complex things. Eleanor Ostrom was right on that point, that the kinds of rules you need to have to actually manage a commons is no small matter. It's not just a question of drawing a boundary and now everyone is there fixed safely and securely in place forever and ever. So whereas the Indigenous rights group imagine that Indigenous people already have this capacity because they imagine them as already kind of governed by communitarian custom. These land reform beneficiaries are not assumed to have this kind of custom, but they are expected to develop it. That's the hope anyway. So that's why the commons figures. You can see how for quite different groups of people, it's become the big hope. Whether your concern is climate change or how to help land reform beneficiaries hold on and not be outcompeted, or the recognition of customary communities, it all converges around the idea of the commons. The second figure, which I will go through a bit more briefly, is co-ops. So why are co-ops suddenly so exciting? So I think we would have to recognize that, in these neoliberal times, many people have been inspired by ideas of a kind of a third way. There must be something in between, communism on one hand and capitalism on the other. There must be some other way of organizing collective economic life which would represent some sort of a third path. And many authors have been writing about that. And the growth of social economy, cooperative movements, and so on is all part of this attempt to find some kind of a third way. Now, in Indonesia, the concept of the co-op goes back certainly to the colonial period, where colonial officials were convinced about the kind of naturally cooperative character of Indonesian village life, thought that they could improve on it by formalizing co-ops, which always failed because of elite capture, lack of trust. It turned out to be not a simple thing, to go from what the assumed cooperative characteristics of everyday life to actually running the economy through a formal co-op. So these things have failed repeatedly. Nevertheless, they are back today with the current president, who has declared co-ops the primary vehicle for what he's calling the people's economy. So this is, again, bringing back a lot of colonial era concepts. A new village law was passed in 2014, which basically treats villages as if they are harmonious and naturally cooperative units capable of managing the economy in the interests of everyone. So this isn't so much about common land, it's about the kind of cooperative capacities, that somehow villages will work this out in such a way that it will be harmonious and everyone will benefit. So these are what I call co-ops for harmonious villages. In some ways, it's an alternative to land reform, because now you're saying we won't worry so much about who owns what, but we will trust in the people to organize their affairs in a harmonious way. So when I actually read one of the land reform documents about this, I found 14 references to collectivity, 10 to communal, like communal, and 65 references to the concept of togetherness. So the documents are littered with the assumption of a natural capacity to cooperate, basically. And that's what's supposed to make all of this work. Co-ops for beneficiaries of land reform. I mentioned the idea is that they will have a communal title as one concept, but that economically they would actually be organized through a co-op is something that's also imagined. And the third category, co-ops for social forestry in the state-claimed forest. This is an attempt to hold together the contradiction that the most lucrative uses of forest land usually is to cut it down, right? You either timber or you cut it down to plant something more productive, like rubber, oil palm, cocoa, coffee, something like that. So in order for the Forest Department to say that it's meeting the objectives for poverty reduction and it's granting the people access to social forest programs inside the government forest estate or the state-claimed forest estate, what will they be doing? How will they be organized? How will this somehow meet these objectives of poverty reduction? So again, co-ops come up, and the idea is that somehow by being organized into co-ops, micro-enterprises, like little non-timber forest collection, small activities can become more lucrative. And the documents have sort of grand ideas about enormous increases in production and, mobilizing value chains and linking up with corporations and so on. So they have the idea that through the cooperative form, somehow impoverished forest villages will also get their share of the wealth. Unfortunately, there is absolutely no example of this, right? There's no example in Indonesia anyway. There's dozens of social forestry programs. They've been heavily funded by donors, and they have never been able to meet their own costs. Right? Never have they replaced donor funding, basically. They are not, in fact, viable economic enterprises. Now, on the other hand, we're supposed to have 12.5 million hectares of this. So just imagine, like the imaginary that the co-op is enabling is one in which somehow just by virtue of working together or by a proper co-op organization, all of these people can now get decent livelihoods. Okay, the third figure, the corporation. Maybe a sort of surprising figure to find in programs for land reform. But of course, in view of the massive presence and the continued expansion of corporate concessions, which, like as I mentioned, continue to be issued, corporations have to figure in there somehow. And the role that they are given in land reform documents is not as enemies of the people, as one would have expected in previous iterations of land reform, but as partners in bringing prosperity to the poor. So what's envisaged then is a kind of a collaboration, mutual accommodation, good governance. Obviously, the tensions around this are severe. One of the land reform documents that I read states that the goal of land reform, quote, is not anti-big business. So they actually feel necessary to state that. It's not anti-big business, but is open to new opportunities for the people's economy through household or collective businesses and co-ops to reach the Pancasila economy, that's like the Indonesian version of kind of win-win, that combines household, collective, co-op, and state-owned and private enterprise. So it's sort of an additive concept. There's room for everybody in our land kind of idea, right? Corporations will be part of it, alongside co-ops and the people. It's also desperate, as one of the phrases I read in one of these documents recognized, one of the paper writers recognized, even as corporations continue to dominate lucrative sectors of the economy, the writer argued, some land must be set aside for the people, preferably in the form of communal land titles, which will be secure. So there is the sense that corporations and their expansion is sort of a game that's over. Like there's no real expectation that that train can be stopped. The idea is that you can make the corporations more benevolent, and you can also go quickly to secure some communal land for the people so the corporations won't get all of it. It's sort of the way in which they figure. In Indonesia's master plan, which was launched in 2011 and is still in effect even with the current government, is really large-scale investment which is encouraged in 22 primary industries, including timber and oil palm, with this big goal of making Indonesia the world's 10th largest economy by 2024. The government continues to deregulate and simplify investment. And FDI grew by 25% between 2011 and 2014 after the rules were changed. So you can see Indonesia is actually doing everything it can to attract large-scale foreign direct investment in primary sectors, plantations and mining, among others. Of course, it's not just foreign corporations, like Indonesian corporations and private investors are also very heavily involved in these fields, always with the argument that expanding plantations bring jobs, development and prosperity to rural areas, claims which activists have long questioned and which I'm kind of actively writing against in much of my current work on the oil palm plantations, is to try to show they do not bring the jobs they promise, they do not bring the prosperity they promise. Like, continuing this mode of expansion under this kind of rationale is simply lacking in evidence, that that's actually what happens. But it's more than that. Corporations are not just present in these documents. They are actually being invoked as land reformers, which is perhaps the more surprising part. We usually think of land reform as something which is worked out between the state and its citizens. Surely that's the domain of governments. But according to the analysis, again, of this Rights and Resources Institute, which has been very active in this field, arguments are made that when state policies fail, or what's called a governance vacuum emerges, that it's the governance vacuum that causes land conflict. And under these conditions, which actually would pertain to most of the places where we work in the Global South, corporations need to take the lead, both to protect their own interests and to promote beneficial outcomes that help meet sustainable development goals. So this is the narrative which is now being promoted by a range of transnational agencies, promoting an active role for corporations in defining and implementing what they call guidelines for responsible investment, guidelines for land governance, human rights documents, and so on, in which the idea is that the corporations will hold themselves to standards very much higher than governments do. It's up to the corporation to abide by human rights, to be responsible in its investment, and so on. Too often, according to this view, states are the cause of the problems that corporations face when they stumble unwittingly, in fact this word unwittingly is used in these documents, into conflict situations because they rely on national governments to assign concession land which turns out to be occupied by people already. So the idea is that corporations want to do the right thing, they want to do things legally, they want to do things correctly, but they are continually stumbling into situations where some government official says, yes, this land is yours now, and it turns out there's people there, and then there's conflict. The corporation faces what they call a reputational risk. And in order to prevent that, both for the benefit of the corporation and the people, corporations have to be the main lead on doing things correctly with land. So basically, corporations as land reformers. And this, again, has been supported by the Rights and Resources Institute with a whole bunch of studies which have actually tried to quantify reputational risk. So what does a company lose when it stumbles in such a way and does not do its homework in terms of the actual land situation on the ground? And it describes scenarios in which NGOs could become involved and they could create a global media event and all kinds of embarrassing things. Therefore, to prevent all of this, corporations have to be ahead of the game. So one of the effects of this kind of way of thinking is actually to leapfrog over the state, or to imagine that you can leapfrog over the state. Somehow the state disappears in this version of land reform, and it's between the corporations and the people to work out, fair deals which will be to the benefit of everyone. The problem, of course, is that you can't wish away the state, right? The state actors are there, they are present in every aspect of investment, whether it's national or transnational investment. So it's not a vacuum in which a corporation can just go in with all of its goodwill and kind of negotiate directly with the people, and all of these greedy and irritating and incompetent officials and inconvenient laws will just disappear off to the sidelines. So that's one way in which corporations are being invoked as land reformers. And the second way is corporations in relation to conflict resolution. So this is an element in which much of the documentation about land reform stresses the problems of conflict and that conflicts need to be resolved. These, of course, are numbers are produced. This is a form of knowledge. In 2017, there were reported to be 659 reported cases covering 520,491.87 hectares. And you have to ask yourself, with this degree of precision in the numbers, like in the authorizing knowledge, clearly there's a picture of a definite number of conflicts, conflict areas, hectares involved. But what this does actually indirectly is it conjures the image of the non-conflict corporation, right? The corporations, it isolates what appear to be the bad cases, the bad actors, the conflict cases, and leaves all the rest aside, as if massive corporate expansion, or what I'm calling reverse land reform, isn't in itself a problem. It's only when it causes conflict that we have to worry about it, right? So this is another way in which, the larger political economic dynamic can be set aside in favor of a technical solution, which is we need to have lots of conflict resolution teams on the ground. Okay, so moving on, the constitutive outside. First of all, what I called these corporate crony cabals. So the premise of land reform is really that there exists a singular state with the authority and the capacity to pursue a reform agenda, right? You have to imagine that the state exists in a form that it could actually intervene in relations between people and land. States are supposed to have monopoly on the authority to state who can do what and where in the national territory. But in fact, no such singular source of authority exists in Indonesia, where multiple authorities, different government departments, usually competing, administrative levels, central, provincial, district, and so on, and also non-state entities compete for jurisdiction. Capacity is also problematic. No one's naive enough to imagine that all government officials are dedicated to serving the public good. But like the distinction between good and bad corporations, the idea that corrupt officials can be isolated to enable good governance to proceed is very problematic. As many political scientists have recently argued in relation to Indonesia, the actually existing form of the state is what they call a state of illegality, which governs through informality, discretion, collusion, clientelism, and predatory extortion. So if that is the actually existing form of the state, who is the state, or who or what is the state who will carry out land reform, right? It assumes there's some other people, not these people, who will be doing this. And of course, that's a big problem because all government officials are involved or very often they're involved directly in land affairs as claimants. So they work together with corporations, they're usually on corporate boards, they're officially appointed to work with corporations to help them resolve land and other issues. So they're not outside the corporation, they're sort of deeply embedded within corporations. And government officials themselves are often trying to use the power that they have in order to take hold of land. So this is quite different from a situation in the Philippines where one might say, first you're a landlord and then you go after state power. In Indonesia, it's more first you're a government official or a politician, you have different kinds of state power, and then you go after land by manipulating the rules, by grabbing, by doing deals with corporations, etc. So what this means is that the idea of the kind of state that could actually implement land reform is really very far from the one that you can find on the ground. Capitalism and class, that's an omitted element from the whole land reform agenda. If you think about the analysis in the mid-50s in the old land to the tiller kind of era was basically a class analysis because it involved peasants and tenants work versus landlords. The understanding was that these were in an antagonistic position and that there was a tendency to polarization among the people. This was actually an intrinsic part of capitalism and was likely to re-emerge. So none of that is present in this except indirectly in the preference for the communal. So you could say in a way that the communal solution is an indirect response to the problem of capitalist relations, but it doesn't really have any measures to hold them at bay. What's got worse in Indonesia recently, or in the last couple of decades, is that the kind of class polarization and landlessness which you found historically in Java going back to the 19th century has now expanded. So now all areas, partly because of the massive expansion of plantations and mines, basically there's a land squeeze almost everywhere now. So the open land frontier, which used to be the safety valve, which allowed people kind of, you pushed out here, you move there, and you can restart your farming enterprise. But now with plantations, mines, and also climate change related intensified policing of forest boundaries have become much tighter. And so actual landlessness is now expanding even in areas where the population is sparse, because it's not just about the number of people in relation to land, is what are the land uses. Often in those areas there are massive land uses for conservation, for plantations, for mining, leaving the people squeezed on small areas of land. So that kind of issue is really not addressed in this land reform agenda. Finally, communists and corpses. I said at the beginning that these are a kind of an absent presence, and what they do is they explain why, how can a government get away with a land reform as crazy as this, or as, you know, one could say as tame as this, you know, with no serious attempt to push back against either corporate concessions, large land holdings. You know, what is the climate in which this could be called land reform? And one would have to say that's where the ghosts of 1965 really come back strongly, because you know, when the Communist Party was eradicated, when the peasant and plantation workers were eradicated, the kind of capacity in rural areas for people to rise up in an organized way to protest was highly truncated. So what you find now are sort of spot protests. People do rise up and protest evictions and land grabbing, but they're not organized into sustained political movements and parties of a kind that could consistently have a program like land reform and say, actually, no, it has to be this, it has to do these things, like these are the problems which must be solved. Right? The fact that those people are absent, they're not present, they're not doing that organizing, the parties do not exist, is part of what enables this to take the form that it does. And the corpses, I put that in, first of all, to remind us, you know, of this gruesome history. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see Joshua Oppenheimer's second film, the one called The Look of Silence, but it's filmed on a plantation in Sumatra among Javanese plantation workers. And for them, it's a landscape littered with corpses, literally, you know, killing fields, places where massacres took place, where bodies are buried, where people were thrown into the river are known. So people in some areas, particularly plantation areas of Sumatra, they live in a landscape which is still haunted by all of that history and all of that violence. Where I'm working on plantations in Kalimantan, it's interesting that's not the case. You could say new frontier, new plantations, new workers who have no kinship link to any of the old workers of Sumatra. You know, they were recruited from elsewhere. So there, the haunting, the corpses are not actually that present to them. But I do think we still need to take them into account in order to understand why, for example, are there no plantation workers' unions anywhere? Why are all the plantations attracted to Indonesia? Because of the catastrophically low cost of labor. Why is the cost of labor so low? Because there's no plantation workers' union, which before the massacres had 1 million members. The plantation workers were the most organized group. Gone, right? And nothing has replaced it. So that's also kind of part of this history. Okay, so to conclude, you know, what I've tried to do here is to use this analytic of assemblage, this idea that, you know, how something is assembled, it takes a lot of work, right? You have to configure something as crazy as, you know, a land reform that looks like that. That takes quite a lot of work, quite a lot of heavy assembly work to make the elements seem plausible and make them cohere. So you have But we can do the reverse engineering of this assemblage to ask critically the question, what is the history of this? What are the elements of this? Why are they presented in this form? Why in this form and not another? Why now? Why are these the actors? What's been left out? We can do this work of identifying the disjunctures, the compromises, the incoherence, the constitutive exclusions, so that we can read these, benign-looking documents and say, well, there's nothing really wrong here, to say, actually, there's lots wrong here, right? It's actually a really terrifying program if you think about it through the lenses that I have suggested, which is an assemblage which appears to meet many goals and around which many players, donor funds, government officials and so on can be mobilized, and even activists from the land reform movement can be brought in fact can be some of the key architects, while the underlying problems are not addressed. I think exposing how something is assembled gives us the capacity to think about how they could be assembled differently, right? Why should this is a creation, it was pulled together. It may very well just fall apart, fragment from its own incoherence, very likely. But we can also help in different ways, perhaps pull it apart, or maybe help it to morph and move in some other directions. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tanya, for this very rich presentation. I think your triangle with common co-ops and corporations plus the constitutive exclusions allows us to discuss the Indonesian case and also to discuss more broadly the current transformation of the very notion of land reform in Indonesia, but in other contexts too. So, questions, comments? Take the microphone in order so that we can record all the session and give your name and institution.
Et vous pouvez me poser des questions en français? Je comprends. C'est juste pour la conférence que ça me manque du vocabulaire.
Alors, je vais poser ma question en français. Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Ayoub El-Ouarti du GRED. Est-ce qu'on peut parler de commun pour ne pas poser cette question directement, qui prend les décisions dans les trois catégories des communs que vous avez expliqués, et est-ce qu'on peut parler de communs dans le cas où les nouveaux bénéficiaires ils n'ont pas de rapport à cette terre-là, c'est des nouveaux bénéficiaires, ils ne participeront, je ne sais pas s'ils participeront ou pas, à l'établissement des règles d'usage et d'accès à cette terre-là. Est-ce que dans ce cas-là, on est toujours dans la logique des communs définie par Ostrom ou autre?
Yes, shall I just respond? Yeah, so I think what's coming up is a communal title. So this capacity to give a title to an area of land on which I presume either many names will be attached or sometimes a co-op will be attached. That's new in the law. But I think you're absolutely right that the thinking about what is a proper commons in Ostrom's sense is so much more than that, right? It's not just a boundary around a piece of land and a list of names. It actually involves everything that she suggests about how rules have to be negotiated and so on. And I think that's the risk here, is that the shortcut is, well, we'll just issue these titles and we will assume that the people will know what to do. Well, why would you make that assumption? Partly because of this ongoing romance of Indonesian culture as kind of naturally communitarian, tending towards harmony and the collective good, which is a myth, but it's a very dearly held one. Many government officials and certainly many activists hold it. So I think that's one of the reasons why the question you're addressing, which is what kinds of commons is this if you've put nothing in place, if you ask myself, well, how is that happening? And I think it's because they drastically underestimate how far they have to go to actually make a proper commons of it. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. My name is Guillaume Duterte. I work for CIRAD. Could you explain a bit more about the way local communities and local stakeholders are involved in either small-scale enterprises or bigger corporations, just to know if the capital coming with the corporation and taking the control of some part of land is only from outside, from the cities, or if there is some kind of embedment of local development. I remember when I was in some part of Java, there was a new kind of regulation allowing the setting up of enterprises which would be set up by local communities in partnership with other investors.
I think you're right. That's partly the imagination behind the co-op, right? The idea is that the villagers will organize themselves as a co-op, and then once unified and having a kind of a legal personality as a co-op, they can then enter into agreements with outside investors and corporations and so on. So this assumes the interest and the capacity to develop kind of cooperative forms. As I said, Indonesia has no history of success in this. It's not common at all. Friends of mine who work in Latin America, where co-ops are actually fairly common. You know, villages often do this thing. You know, organize a co-op for selling their coffee or selling their produce and so on. Like, there's a long history of successful co-op organization. Right? People recognize the form, they know the work it takes, and so on. That actually isn't so in Indonesia, although it's been talked about for centuries, starting certainly with the Dutch. They actually do not have a successful tradition of village co-ops. The ones which existed in the Suharto era were state creations, and they were always elite co-opted. They were actually vehicles for subsidizing the elite. You know, you call it a co-op and you give them subsidized or free fertilizer. Basically, these are what I used to call state-sponsored class formation. Right? These are ways in which the government could channel money to village elites who were in charge of keeping the country peaceful. They were not movements of the people for their own kind of collective benefit. All of the oil palm plantations now work with local co-ops, or so they're supposed to. These are set up by the corporations as a mode of interfacing with the villagers, because they don't want to deal with villages individually. They think it's too much trouble. They want to deal with, you know, one institution. But if you look inside these so-called co-ops, they have a horrible record of elite capture, corruption, technical failure. So it isn't, you know, it's not to say it could not be built, but the problem is the assumption that it's kind of naturally present. And that's where I think this thing really falls apart. But the model you're suggesting of a co-op in alliance with a corporation, that's all over the land reform documents. That's what's imagined as one of the ways that you can have this harmonious working together to everyone's benefit. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. You've explained that 65% of the area is considered by the state as national forest. What I didn't get or understand is how did this phenomenon happen, and when, if it is related to the counter-revolution process.
Yeah. Okay. It happened through the forest law of 1967. So just 1 year after Suharto took power, and 1 to 2 years after the massacres. And basically it was a unilateral declaration, a claim by the state forest department, according to the law, the State Forest Department was supposed to gazette the land, piece by piece, village by village, establishing boundaries, and it was actually supposed to be a collaborative process. None of that happened. So the 65% state-claimed forest, when some of the activists went digging to see where's the paperwork, where's the actual map, where's the documentation which says it belongs to the state. The government officials have always said it's theirs, but where's the paper to back it up? It didn't exist. So these are basically lines drawn on a map as a unilateral claim to land, a kind of imposition of power, a grab. Since they were discovered to have failed to gazette the land, they got very busy gazetting. And now, apparently, a large part of it has been formally claimed by the Forest Department. So gazetting means, there's a formal declaration. In Village X, these areas, belong to the forest. And, there's a document. It's like a formal map plus document type of deal, right, which actually creates the formal claim as opposed to just a line on a map on the wall of the Forest Department to say, all of this belongs to us, and there's actually been no process at all. So one of the interesting things about Forest Department maps is they don't have any villages in them, and they certainly don't have village boundaries. So they claim areas of forest as if that didn't overlap civil jurisdictions. There's districts and provinces and villages inside this area, but all of that is just ignored on the map. It's as if there's one unified territory in which the Department of Forest presides. So it's always been a bit of a legal fiction. And as I said at the beginning, you can't evict all the people all the time, right? So 60 million people living in these areas, some of them have been harassed and evicted. But a lot of people still live in this land, but they live in a kind of legal limbo, a sort of a gray zone, where at any moment the State Forest Department could come along and say, well, we've allowed you to live on state land because, we're kind to you, but now the game is over, we've allocated this land to a concession or a plantation, you've got to leave. So this could happen at any time. That's basically the basis of it.
Thank you. Gwen Pulia from the French National Center for Scientific Research. I was wondering whether this kind of gray zone fueled any mobilization towards a more just land reform. And what is the space for justice in the debate around land reform? Because you mentioned it's rather technical. And this is, but is there any kind of social goal beyond that?
Well, I think for the activists who are now inside the government, who are now working on the land reform from the inside, these are still people who are deeply committed to social justice. They started on the outside, protesting evictions, land grabbing, forest concessions, and all the rest of it. And now they've come inside with the hope that they could make some gains, that they could work with the present government, that they could, if not do everything, they could expand the realm of space, that more compromises could be negotiated, better ones, by virtue of launching such a program. So these are not naive people. They're, they have the same education we do. In fact, some of them were our students. They came to do their PhDs on land governance and anthropology and such things, right? So they are not naive, but they've made a sort of a gamble that by working inside, they will be able to expand the scope of justice. Now, a lot of their friends stayed outside and are vigorously criticizing them, saying, you've sold out. What kind of a land reform is this? You've lost your way here. So I guess that's a sort of a political judgment, right? You have to, I think many people face that. Many people who work in the development apparatus also face that, right? It's the thing is flawed, but you kind of think maybe you can still do something useful from the inside, or you decide, actually no, it's too flawed. you cannot be inside, you have to stay outside, right? So I think that sort of thing is going on. So the visions of justice are still there, but this is what's on offer currently. And what was interesting to me is that to see that, in fact, it's not idiosyncratic. Although it's an Indonesian case, I think elements of this assemblage are actually coming up in many other places as well. So on the one hand, it has a particular Indonesian genealogy, which roots through the corpses, the destruction of the Communist Party, the whole sad history of land reform. Also all the hopes around the indigenous peoples movement. Like there are some elements which have a distinct Indonesian trajectory, but some of these elements are globally circulating. And so what's interesting is, how they can be made or somehow appear to be made to cohere in this particular beast. Yeah. But is it an encouraging picture, in my view? Not really. No.
Okay, so I'm Nelly Leblond, and my question goes in the same direction of Gwen's question. It's I don't really understand, why does the Indonesian government engage with this land reform? I understand there might be a land crisis or some internal pressure. You were talking about this inside activists, but still land reform is a very risky business. So what's in it for them? Is it like an economic calculus to capture development funds, or is it a political calculus to stay in power, or does it have to address a crisis? And if it doesn't, as you seem to explain, then what happens? How come it's not criticized in a much more important fashion?
Yeah, right. So what are the calculations? They are partly political. I think, this current president came in on a populist platform, and the land reform and indigenous movements supported him because they thought that he would be different. Now, so many years into his rule, they're not convinced. In fact, his populism seems to have been extremely shallow and opportunistic. It's not clear anymore. The gamble they took in jumping in with him, it's like, here's a guy who seems to want to do the right thing. Let's work with him. Let's push this historical moment as far as we can. Let's see how we can push forward a land reform agenda which has been stalled for so many decades. You can see why they hoped they could do that. So it was, I think, on the president's part, a political calculus to bring in a kind of a populist face, which is looking very thin now. I think there is certainly a donor element too, right? The donors are all over this. It's interesting, the amount of donor energy that's going on around land these days, including communal titling is very big for many donors. Issues which, people in this room, you've all been working on land issues for, some of you, for many decades, but it's back in the news, right? A lot of governments and donors are actively working on this front again now. So the question is, why now, but also why these forms? And I think they're related. I actually think that the climate change one is one of the bigger ones. I think that's what, governments like Indonesia have to be seen to be doing something with this, and there are large donor funds attached. And so saying, well, we're going to respect our indigenous people, we're going to help them to do what they naturally do, apparently, which is to conserve the forest. You can see why this seems actually rather cheap, in a sense, a way of gaining international credibility, donor funds, and maybe some populist currency locally. I think the bigger question you're posing is when this kind of, we've all seen these kind of multi-stakeholder things, they've been around for a long time. And the question is, what is the price of failure? What happens when an assemblage like this does not meet people's expectations? Does it just quietly fizzle out? People forget. The thing falls apart, the documents sit on a shelf and gather dust. Or does it have other kinds of repercussions which could in fact be more politicizing? Where people say, actually, you're promising us land reform. What you've been doing so far is not that. We insist, we're going to hold you to your word. So that would be an optimistic view of an assemblage such as this, right? That you could actually take hold of it and repopulate it, morph the terms back to the ones that you may have begun with, right? In which something like a commons or even a co-op, meant something that you would want to promote. But the question is the organizational terrain. You're still dealing in Indonesia with a complete vacuum where the Communist Party once stood, right? In terms of a large, there's no Farmers' Party, there's no Poor People's Party. There really are no mass movements of a scale that could consistently fight for this. So the peasant unions in Java are the biggest, and some in Sumatra. But they are not nationally visible. They're visible to the likes of us who hang around in muddy rural places, but they don't have the national stage in a way that would really shift the balance of forces, I would say. So that's a question. And I think that, to my mind, another C that could be on this diagram, if I was really to go crazy, would be the conjuncture. This is a particular historical conjuncture in Indonesia, like a coming together of certain historical forces. And I think even with some of the same elements in another location, the conjuncture could be different. Like maybe the crony corporate cabals, for example, could not get away with murder. There would be more assumption that government officials actually have to abide by the law. There's no such assumption really in Indonesia. It's not expected. Maybe you wouldn't have, these figures. You wouldn't have this amount of intimidation, this amount of experienced repression. I don't know, maybe some of you who work in other contexts would say some of the elements are the same, but the conjuncture is really different, and therefore you'd expect it to produce quite different results. I don't know, I'm just sort of throwing it out there to say that there's both a general element to this and there's a specific, Indonesian history element configuring it. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question, maybe about regional differences within Indonesia about the land reform. I was just wondering about the historical region where transmigration occurred, so in the eastern part, Sulawesi, or even maybe West Papua. How does it work? Is it beyond the scope of the land reform, or is it a sort of opportunity to harden the divide between local people, so customary or indigenous people, and the migrants coming from Java or other parts of Western Indonesia? Maybe with, on the one hand, communal title for indigenous people and individual title, on the other hand, for migrants, or this kind of divide, or I don't know. That's an open question.
Wow. There was a time when we all thought the transmigration program was dead, because it was widely opposed. After Suharto was deposed, people in many areas started to kick out transmigrants and basically say these people were imposed on us, the land was grabbed from us, we never conceded to having all these people on our land. So there was some rather ugly kind of ethnic cleansing type of evictions that went on in many areas. Now, I would have to say transmigration is back. It's being used to support the oil palm industry. So when plantations are being set up in frontier areas which don't yet have either a lot of people or which haven't yet dispossessed all the people, like if the locals are still in control over their land, there's no way they want to be plantation workers. You only create them as a labor pool when you have dispossessed them more thoroughly, right? So that they now no longer have an independent land base. That's something I've been writing about, the sort of the multi-generational trajectory of dispossession. It's not a sort of one-off. It takes time to saturate the land with plantations enough to generate a local labor pool. So what fills the gap is transmigration. So you bring in outsiders as workers. These workers very quickly start to buy up land all around the plantation. The locals start to get squeezed, but the real squeeze takes some time before people really feel it. So specifically in terms of because the plantation development is carrying on, so too is transmigration, and to that extent it's not addressed here. one of the ambiguous categories in this land reform is this one. 4.5 million hectares to be excised from the state-claimed forest and allocated to beneficiaries. The worry here is that that will be to transmigrants, that it will actually be a continuation of transmigration. So again, in the name of land to the poor, there will be an expansion. Some parts of the land reform documents refer to transmigration, but I think they generally keep it quiet because it's hugely unpopular.
Maybe I have a short comment. At the beginning of your presentation, you said that the land reform in the 20th century, it was easy. Because, no, it was not easy, but you have a sort of target category which was clear, it was the farmers. And now you have a land reform with multiple actors that are not only farmers, and it's sometimes very difficult to find farmers. And I think there are cases of land reform which are not agrarian reform, but rather restitutive reform, like in South Africa, where you see the government desperately looking for peasants to distribute land because they don't find any farmers in a strict sense. So I think there are situations where the target of the land reform is very difficult to find physically, in a way. So to find this category of people who could be deemed as farmers.
I see. I think that's not the case here. At least half the people on Java are still basically depending on farming. It's still a heavily agrarian society. I think Indonesia's now hit 50% urban, but some of this, as you know, with urbanization has to do with the way places are classified. You can appear to have urbanization, which is really a reclassification of peri-urban land as urban, for example, rural land as urban. So not all of these farmers in Java are full-time farmers. So certainly you get patterns of circular migration, you get a certain amount of off-farm work. But this is actually long-standing because, as I said, back in the 19th century, at least 20%, or I think some of the documents say 30% of the population was already landless. So they were already working as wage workers in agriculture or in other fields. But nevertheless, you can still find tens of millions of farmers on Java. Off Java, agriculture is still the main mode of production, and some innovations, like in fact oil palm, for example, because it's so lucrative, even in rural areas where you might think prosperous people would want to send their children out of farming, and there's a kind of a suggestion that the younger generation doesn't want to farm. But I've worked in areas actually, in the middle of crop booms, so the cocoa boom. One of our students worked on a potato boom in Java. Now I'm working on, these are boom crops which are extremely lucrative. And young people recognize that there's no better game in town. You can go get a government job and you'll be paid a tiny thing. It may have some prestige attached. But if you want to make real money, you've got to be a farmer. So farming is not necessarily residual or dying kind of art, but it depends what you're farming, what's your type of enterprise. What is true is that government support for smallholders is extremely thin. So, it's easy to go under as a farmer. It doesn't have, as you have in France, like an enormous program of subsidies of farming, right? A lot of people are kept in the game of farming through state transfers or EU transfers and so on, which keep a lot more people able to continue to farm who would otherwise, on strict market principle, not be viable. Indonesia has very, very little of that. So it's also a pretty brutal environment where you can go out of business. I showed that in my book Land's End very clearly. That was a book looking at the arrival of cocoa in a highland area where people had not previously they'd had cash crops but not perennial crops. So as they planted cocoa, they effectively privatized their land because perennials have that effect. A land market emerged, polarization emerged. But what was remarkable was that There were absolutely no state transfers, nothing like the Bolsa Familia or these other kind. There was no transfers, and there was basically no remittances. So these were people who had to sink or swim on the productivity of their own farms without external support. In many places you go in rural Africa, South America and Asia, what looks like a rural smallholding is actually massively subsidized by state transfers and remittances. Right? These are enterprises which would not survive without this. So many more people are kept in farming because of state transfers and remittances. Indonesia actually has a lousy record of state transfers. Some areas do have remittances, not the places where I've worked, but remittances could be one of the factors. But this idea that you can't really find a farmer, it's really not like South Africa. South Africa was de-agrarianized, a century ago in a very thoroughgoing way. People were de-skilled from agriculture, they were dislodged from land, and that really isn't the case.
But in terms of international comparison, that's interesting to take into account this kind of criteria of do we have this target category of farmers? And the second question would be, and it's interesting in the case of Indonesia, are the farmers, so to say, produced locally or transported from one place to another one through transmigration or other devices?
No, those are absolutely crucial questions, I think. And the meaning of land reform would be completely different. You're right, yeah.
Thank you very much. Etienne Rodari from RID. I was wondering whether you could give us a little bit more of the actual history, the grounded history of this land reform and the chance that it will actually happen in ways that are not just this kind of assemblage, which is quite far away from the ground, from the actual location. And I ask this question because I've been working on South Africa, and as Pierre was saying, the narrative of land reform in South Africa has been very, very strong, and as strong as the chance that they will do some land reform one day is very, very thin. I mean, there is no incentive for the government to do an actual land reform in South Africa for different reasons. But I mean, there is no way for them to actually implement these things. So I was wondering whether you could give us some more information about what they have been doing on the field to actually implement something, and whether it will happen in the ways that you have been describing, either good ways or bad ways. But I think we miss some more historical information about the way it has been implemented.
Yeah, thank you. So of course it is still fairly new, right? It was only begun in 2016, so we don't really yet have a lot of documentation about the history of what was actually implemented. What I do know is that in the province where I worked for one of the book which I should actually discuss tomorrow, The Will to Improve, that's one of the target areas. So I have a local NGO that I work with there are sort of monitoring the process, and what they've been trying to do is to see on the ground how do these categories get negotiated. So, how is land classified actually parcel by parcel? Who is considered to be a suitable beneficiary? Who actually gets the land? Who loses the land? To what extent is land actually changing hands, or is it really only a process of formalization where the land that people already had previously gets regularized in some way? I think the whole question of how this is worked out on the ground, for better and worse, is definitely one level at which this has to be tracked. And it's quite likely to diverge quite strongly depending on both the local configuration and also the local implementers. To what extent they're really attentive to the risks of capture, actually seeking results which, on the one hand, they may be seeking, one type of result they're clearly seeking is an auditable one, that they have to produce the numbers. We have to show that they have successfully reformed, so many hectares of land. So that would produce a kind of a thin result where superficially things have been done, but whether it will actually hold is an open question. And then there's the other kind of work which may not show up in the numbers, but could have to do with this much more challenging work of actually trying to figure out, well, what would land reform look like in this village? What would you actually do? Who would change their position in what ways? And I think we have to see how it actually plays out. But I think the more likely outcome is that not much will happen. But as I've argued with others of these kinds of interventions, I would say, even if not much happens on the ground, as an assemblage, one could say as a discourse, it already has certain effects, right? It's still there. It's changing the field of play in certain ways. If nothing else, it's bringing in a whole new slew of donor funds. There's people running around the country carrying out land reform. A lot of people are in a sense, it's become a project, it's subject to the usual flows of development funding. So there are all kinds of effects. What exactly they will be in different areas is something that one would have to track. Yeah.
Okay, then maybe it's not a question, but a reaction to what has been just said on South Africa. It's kind of weird for me to hear that there's no small farmers in South Africa. There's a lot of farmers, and I think it's important not to ask for more elements from Indonesia, but to bring some more other elements from Southern Africa. And indeed, there has been a lot of land reforms, not in the 60s, but rather in the 1990s, because apartheid ended in the 90s in South Africa, but also in Namibia. And then we have blocked land reform in Zimbabwe with the Lancaster agreements, and then it's going to come later on. And then we have land reform in Mozambique in 1997. So it's later in time. And it's still a very hot and political topic, and maybe it's just not the time for embarking or engaging once again in land reform for governments in Southern Africa. So this is a first element. Yet, even though there's not a new land reform in South Africa or in Mozambique or in Namibia, I think the assemblage you just described is very relevant for several of these countries. We see the same mapping season is coming of age, and there's a lot of mapping of indigenous communities or local communities, and a lot of mapping for corporations, and a lot of titling projects for individual land title or collective land title. So the assemblage you just described, and the conjuncture also with this populism from some governments, with some idea to secure development funds and the interest of development agencies, and also the corps of liberation wars, of civil wars, that have really diminished the capacity of farmers to organize at a national level, to push for a redistributive land reform. We also see this in several countries, South Africa, Mozambique, or Namibia. And so I'm not so sure that's because there's no farmers in South Africa that we don't see it, or nothing labeled a land reform, that there's not the same assemblages going on in Southern Africa, and that makes your example very relevant for this part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there any other experiences which would have any resonance with this, or is this really anything that anyone's working on? I'm interested to know, how far this travels or doesn't travel.
I think that people working on Mexico should have things to say about land reform.
A very different political history in Mexico, but yeah.
I don't remember what he says. He said in terms of, the words that he used. But there are farmers, obviously, in South Africa, but there are no peasants, so to say. So the point, going back to this idea of national territories, versus like global kind of narratives. There is a trend within the ANC to have like a land reform, and that land reform would go directly against every, large trends of industrialized agricultures versus a more peasant-based kind of new form of agriculture that they will have to create from scratch, because there is no peasants. There are peasants working, next to the houses in former Bantustan, but they are not able to actually have like hectares of lands and create like a farm. So for the government, the option is to say, okay, we're gonna destroy the industrialized agricultural sector that we have for something that will be completely apart from any global norms and rules in terms of how to devise agriculture today. So the step for South Africa would be very, very, very big, and I do think that ANC will never try this kind of thing. They will pretend that they do some reform, and they actually do, but on a very, very limited scale, and they won't do something larger than what they are actually doing, even though they say the contrary before each election. And for South, I'm sorry, but for Zimbabwe, we cannot say it's a land reform. It's just a political move. So it's I don't know if you agree, but it's not. It hasn't been devised as a land reform.
One of my students worked in Venezuela under Chavez, and what was interesting there was that he was very taken by arguments of the Via Campesina, populist wave about the virtues of the peasant farm. But Venezuela is highly urbanized. It's something like 80% urban population and has been for many decades. So that would be another example like the South African one, where his fantasy of kind of reconstructing a peasant countryside would have to reverse a trend of many decades, send people back to the land. And so on the one hand, though, he had a populist rhetoric about land to the tiller, but what he actually did was sponsor state farms, which had a different objective, which was food sovereignty at the national level, like how to use petrol revenues, when they still had some, to try to reduce the food import dependence. And we can see now in Venezuela like a complete food catastrophe, right? Because Venezuela imports all its food. They don't have any peasants. They don't actually have that many farmers. They don't grow much. And so, and that's been long recognized. But that would be another example of where, the land reform that was envisaged, and Chavez imagined that all of these urban informal sector workers would just jump on the buses and go back to the countryside because they were going to be given land, and no one wanted to go. So that's a different kind of land reform. That would be sort of like rebuilding a peasant situation according to an ideology, even when the economic conditions do not exist. I don't think that's true in Indonesia. I think that a lot of these small-scale farms which are being taken over by the plantations are viable farms, or they could be. People have land, they're farming, they're growing rice, they're growing rubber, other things. Given access to roads, they would be very happy to add oil palm. It's a very lucrative crop. A few hectares of that and you can send your kids to college. You want to be a farmer. You want to be a well-supported farmer, with a good infrastructure and so on. But it's not a question of having to recreate a peasantry which no longer exists in Indonesia. If you let this plantation train continue to run, eventually you will actually create that situation, right, where people are not able to live on the land. Yeah. But they're not there yet.
Thank you, Tana, for this very interesting multifocal analysis. Sorry to speak French, but okay. Alors, ce qui me paraît être intéressant et en même temps très questionnant, c'est l'absence dans ce contexte de violence d'État, y compris par la réforme foncière, l'absence de problématique de l'autochtonie, comme on en parle ailleurs, hein, ou même de prémices de Sons of the Soil Wars, hein, il y a toute une de guerre d'autochtonie. Sons of the Soil Wars. You know? No. Oui, c'est une catégorie de guerre civile qui fait l'objet de beaucoup d'analyses et qui n'est pas du tout réservée à l'Afrique. Asie, par exemple, Timor. Et alors, ma question c'est il n'y a pas de place pour ce genre de problématique dans ce que vous dites. Alors, on pense, concernant l'Indonésie, on pense à Aceh, comment on prononce, c'est ça, hein? Aceh. Voilà. Donc ma question, c'est qu'en est-il de cette problématique de guerre d'autochtonie en réaction non seulement à des migrations, mais en réaction aussi à la violence d'État, notamment dans le cadre de ce genre de réforme foncière.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So by autochthony, do you mean at the level of what in Indonesia is called kind of customary communities? Indigeneity. So that definitely does exist, right? This first component, the customary commons of indigenous people, c'est le commun des collectifs coutumiers. C'est ce qu'on traduit comme les indigenous people. So that is a big figure. Ça, c'est très grand dans ce programme, de reconnaître ces droits. Mais comme j'ai expliqué, pour qualifier à ce type de droit, on doit être presque hunter-gatherer, quelqu'un qui ne se met pas dans l'économie moderne. Et c'est très difficile à en trouver, parce que la plupart des gens, même isolés, sont depuis plusieurs décennies, sinon des centuries, dont ils se mettent même dans le monde marché.
Là où il y a des guerres d'autochtonie, les gens qui se prétendent autochtones n'ont pas demandé la permission de se rebeller ou de s'organiser contre l'État. Apparemment, en Indonésie, il n'en est pas question.
So there have been moves like this. So, for example, in Aceh, there was one of the biggest evictions of Javanese transmigrants. So, in the context of the attempt at Aceh autonomy, they tried to expel all the Javanese that they thought had been sent there by the central government in order to dilute the possibility of autonomy for Aceh. So that became a war among the people. Let's just say the transmigrants were chased out because they were understood to be placed there by a hostile Indonesian state. And so the Acehnese had to take back. So you get this type of level of, you could call that a sort of a guerre des autochtones. It's a kind of ethnic cleansing. Another type which existed historically was the takeover of Dutch plantations. So the takeover of foreign plantations in the name of the people. Those plantations were then given to the army, which still controls them today, right? So what started out as, you could say, a kind of a movement to reestablish people's control over territory was taken over by a branch of the state, right? So there are versions of this. And I think it's interesting, often they are fairly vicious from the side of the people. They're not kind. Like ethnic cleansing is a horrible thing, right? And it's one of the possible consequences of a kind of autochthonous movement. And I know it's been much written about in Africa as well. So there have been waves of that in Indonesia too, and it's a big risk. I don't know that it translates exactly, because that's why I asked you, guerre contre qui? Is it against other Indonesians who are in the wrong place? Is it a war against foreign companies? Or is it a war against a state apparatus understood to be oppressive and dispossessory? Right? These are all different kinds of fronts that people might have. Yeah.
You invited us to talk about different cases. So I didn't have a question, but here is what I was wondering or thinking, based on my experience, on my case, of what you've explained to us, and it has something to do with what you've explained about South Africa. I work at the Universidad de Buenos Aires. I come from Buenos Aires, not from Buenos Aires, but from Argentina. And when you told us that in the forest, in that area of the forest, there is 60 million people, which is much more than all of the amount of people that lives in my country. The first thing that I wonder is why are they not at the villages, at the city? How? Because I think of the experience of my country, and all of that people would be incorporated into the mass of the city growth. You see, expelled from land. So that's something I was wondering. I was thinking of in Argentina there is one place that would resemble just a little bit to the experience that you're talking about. That is one province, the province of Misiones, which is pretty close to the border between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Therefore, there is a process of movement of people and an intensification of the production in the forest in Misiones, but related to expels in other places, you see. But what I was wondering, and here is a question, is maybe you might help us to understand a little bit how is the relationship between these people and the plantations in terms there are probably many circuits, circulation of economical or political circulation or symbolical circulations that are invisible. They might be invisible, but if you have found some of these processes that might explain why are there so many people living in the forest and producing in the forest. If there is a relationship with the corporations in terms of, I don't know, of markets, of food markets, I have no idea.
Right, okay, thank you. So 60 million people living in the state claim forest are mostly outside Java, so they're on what we call the outer islands, and their production is sometimes shifting cultivation of rice and corn, so rotational agriculture, usually combined with some cash crops. So rubber, which started off in Indonesia as a plantation crop, was quickly taken over by small-scale farmers, who outcompeted the plantations with their efficiency and low cost. And rubber is a very people-friendly crop because you can dry it yourself, you can take it to the market on the back of your bicycle, it doesn't require a truck or even a road. So a lot of people in these areas are involved in the cash economy. It's a mixed subsistence and cash economy, which has been present for, in some cases, almost a century, because rubber became popular around 1910, between 1910 and 1920. So almost a century of mixed food and cash crop farming. And that's more or less how people in these areas have been living. Sometimes they have cocoa, sometimes they have coffee, other cash crops, and usually some food crops as well. So why did they not leave? Indonesia has not had what I would call a proper agrarian transition. Like there has not been successful industrialization or development of urban manufacture of a kind which could pull people into the cities. This has happened in Malaysia. It has happened actually in Thailand, and it seems to be happening in Vietnam. So some parts of the region are having a rural depopulation which is based on the pull of the city and the successful transfer to an urban mixed service and manufacturing economy. Indonesia has not, it's not that it has some of that, but it does not have anything like enough of that to draw people away from the rural area. So the actual net number of people living in the countryside is more now than it has ever been. So even though the proportion in the cities is larger, because the population is still growing, albeit not very fast, there's actually, I think I once counted it, like 20 million more people living in the countryside now than there was 20 years ago. So the countryside is still full of people. It's not a question of people being drawn off. Lots of the Malaysian countryside has no people in it. The only people, well, no people, the only people there are plantation workers who are Indonesian, right? They've crossed the border to work in Malaysian plantations because Malaysians don't want to do this kind of work. Dirty work, rural work, plantation work. So why are people still in the country? Partly there's been no agrarian transition. To the extent that they still have access to land, they're still better off in the countryside than they are in urban slums, where life is extremely hard. It's also a country of huge sort of diversity. So if you're expelled from the land in Sulawesi and you want to go to the capital city, Jakarta, first of all, it's a different island, it's a different language. You're going to be out-competed by, a good 20 million underemployed Javanese who are far better networked than you, right? So it's not that easy to move to the city, actually, in Indonesia. It's a little bit different from Argentina, I think, where there's more of a national integration. In terms of the relationship with the corporations, in some of these areas there are corporations, right? There are sort of corporate plantations. One of the interesting migration patterns is actually urban to rural, because the plantations often recruit their workers from among the urban lumpen in Java. So they recruit some of these urban underemployed people to go and work on plantations where they're actually paid better. So it's actually an urban to rural movement for plantation labor specifically, organized by the plantation companies or sometimes spontaneous. People just take off, landless in Java, ran into debt, motorbike was seized, couldn't pay your credit, run away from your creditors, hop on a boat, go to Kalimantan and look for work on a plantation. That's a pretty common story. So the plantations are recruiting migrant workers from within Indonesia, mainly people or underemployed or landless people for whom this is a better option. The locals tend not to work for plantations until they have to. And they have to when, as I mentioned earlier, the plantations saturate. If there are so many plantations that people are left with insufficient land for autonomous production, then they are a captive labor reserve. So in Sumatra, this took about a century to reach this level of saturation. In the area where I'm working now in Kalimantan, they're already there after 30 years. So, originally the first plantation came and the village elders said, when the plantations came, we thought our land was as big as the sea. And he did not know that already in the district map, the entire district had been mapped out in plantation blocks and given out in concessions. But they weren't all developed immediately, right? So it takes time for all of these plantations to actually materialize. And so the process of people becoming dispossessed, you could say, and I wrote about this as like land grabs which happen slowly, you know, in the sense that it's not a one-off thing. A plantation may come here and you may think, well, that's annoying, but I can just shuffle to the side. You know, we still have our land over there. You don't yet experience landlessness until over there also has a plantation, right? And then suddenly, right? So you could eventually depopulate the countryside. Like you could make it impossible for people to live there, except unless you work for a plantation. But the plantations are not huge employers. They employ one person per 5 to 10 hectares. Rubber, on the other hand, is a ratio of 1 to 1. So they're not massive employers, actually, oil palm. They do employ some workers, but not that many. So that, for me, is one of what I say, you know, what I see as the big problem of the reverse land reform. You know, this massive allocation to plantations is not only that it takes up so much land and squeezes out the low-key but still viable agrarian livelihoods which people already have in these areas, which are now becoming harder and harder, monopolizes land and does not absorb much labor in a context where the exit strategy, like the agrarian transition, you know, like move to the city, is actually not in place. And it is very different from Malaysia. Malaysia, rural people don't want to work on the farm. They don't want to work on the plantation. They leave it to the Indonesians, of whom there are many. So, you know, that would be a context where there really is a shift of population and shift of relationships. That's really not happening. So, you know, the way I've often written about this is, you know, it's a problem when the land is needed, but the people are not. You know, in the sense that the land is needed on a very large scale, and the workers that are needed are relatively few. Right? So you have a dispossessory dynamic in which, you know, the idea of primitive accumulation, that you take over land in order to generate a labor force, not immediately. I mean, eventually, you will, in fact, generate your own labor reserve. You know, people who are holding on in the little nooks and crannies around the plantations. But in the short run, you actually have to import labor because you haven't sufficiently dispossessed the people, right? They still have land, and so they will not present themselves as labor. So it's a sort of a, you know, I've been writing about this now as what I'm calling like an intergenerational dynamic. It's not a one-off thing. It's a transformation which takes some time. But in my mind, this is the big emergency. Like, this is what land reform ought to be addressing. You know, as like you're saying, don't worry about what you're distributing. Just stop this train. Like, stop issuing more plantation concessions. Like, stop taking land from the people to give it to the corporations. Just stop doing that in itself would be a massive step forward, right? Let alone redistributing or restituting or many of the other things you could do. But that train is still running in the wrong direction.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Don't you think that this process might explain, at least partially, the lack of social mobilization? Precisely this, the fact that the deposition is not immediate.
Mm. I do think so. Yes, I think that's a big element. That this kind of thing creeps up. You're not initially aware. This is why I have my debate with this idea of free, prior, and informed consent? You know, I don't know what it is in French, but this idea that, you know, you can get the people's agreement. And I'm thinking, who could be informed? Who could actually picture 5,000 hectares or 10,000 hectares? How could you inform? I can't imagine what that looks like. Right? Even if I have a satellite image, it's hard to imagine, right? And if you don't have a satellite image, you can't imagine the expanse. And who can actually forecast a generation from now or 2 generations from now what people's land needs will be? Right? There's so much that people cannot know in the present when you're asking them to agree to something which will completely change their relationship to the land, to communities, to farming futures permanently. And so I'm not sure that it's just a question of talking to them more. You know, I think there's something about the finality of this transfer and of this land conversion, which is extremely risky, you know, and I don't think that information can be sufficient to that. You know, we can look at this and say, well, you know, 2 generations from now you're going to be dispossessed, but people will say, well, but right now he's offering me enough money to buy a motorbike. So, you know, what's a guy to do, right? You can see how people who are not really in a position to understand the long-term process will be very tempted by, or sometimes actually fraudulently enticed by short-term promises. So I've been thinking about this issue of tenure. You know, we think of it usually spatially, but I think we also have to think of it temporally. Like tenure is a hold over a period of time. And sometimes the period of time is as important as the dimensions. Like some of the plantation leases are sometimes for 90 years. Like that's so many generations of people will be born and die in that period. Like that's an enormous period of time for which land is being tied up, you know, in a certain kind of corporate form. So I think we should be paying attention to the duration as well as the expanse. And I think it's like, again, I think it's something very hard for people to really picture.
Ok. Bon, ben, on va remercier Taniali pour l'exposé et le débat riche. Et puis, juste avant qu'on se quitte, demain, comme on a décidé d'exploiter la force de travail de notre conférencière, elle fait une présentation demain à l'IRD, à l'amphithéâtre de l'IRD à Agropolis, à 14h30. Là, ce sera autour du livre The Will to Improve, donc un livre d'anthropologie du développement qu'elle a écrit il y a 10 ans et sur lequel elle va revenir 10 ans après, justement. Toujours sur l'Indonésie, mais toujours avec cette idée d'avoir un débat plus large que le cas spécifique indonésien, bon, qui suffirait au débat, ceci dit. Ouais. Voilà, et ce livre, The Will to Improve, le titre français n'est pas encore fixé, va être publié en français chez Cartala incessamment. Voilà, merci encore.